welcome, of course, Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff, who will be speaking to us tonight. This shir is sponsored, and we greatly appreciate and thank Marilyn Smilowitz for sponsoring Rabbi Dr. Eleff's talk. Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff is the Chief Academic Officer of the Hebrew Theological College and Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College. Rabbi Dr. Eleff is the author of 9 books and more than 40 articles in the field of American Jewish history. His most recent book is Authentically Orthodox, A Tradition-Bound Faith in American Life. And his title tonight is Gedolim, Das Torah, and the Modern Orthodox Jew. So without further ado, thank you for joining us in virtual West Orange, Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Zwickler and Rabbi Shabbat. Wonderful to see you virtually again, a good friend from our Yeshiva College days. To Greg and to Marilyn Smilowitz again, I'm very appreciative that you thought to sponsor discussion today. Authentically Orthodox was my most recent book. It's now in regular people's pricing. It just came out in paperback. I put the link so that maybe somebody other than my mother would own a copy. Make sure that one of the two joys, I suppose, now of Zoom are really twofold. Number one is that I don't have to wear a mask while lecturing. And number two, I can, I used to have these very distinctive looking two-tone source sheets. That would come whenever I would be a scholar in residence. I was very unkind to trees, and I would have these elaborate source sheets I worked very hard on them, and now I work very hard on these PowerPoints, which is a different medium, a different way to connect. As Rabbi Zwickler, thank you so much for the introduction. Gedolim, Das Torah, and the Modern Orthodox Jew. Our business here is not to discuss the theology of Das Torah. I'm neither a political scientist nor a magician, so I can't work on that level, but I would like instead to outline how this very critical mode of communication between rabbis and lay people was essential in a large portion, a growing portion of the American Orthodox community, and exists obviously in Israel as well. But I'll focus here on America, where Das Torah becomes an integral piece of continuity for American Orthodoxy and for the modern Orthodox community, who doesn't by and large adopt the concept of Das Torah, and we'll outline and define it in a little bit. Questions emerge specifically about continuity. And by continuity, I want to take us back to 1979, and Peter Berger, not Jewish, writes the book, The Heretical Imperative, Contemporary Possibilities of Religious Affirmation. There was a book written shortly after this time in which a clever, maybe an obnoxious footnote had it, that this little book, came out in a little form of like this, was passed around in the back seats of Rabbi Soloveitchik's shir. So it struck a nerve, this little tome, and a very important social thinker, Peter Berger, offers the following, the very first chapter actually. Yet those who affirm an Orthodox, he's writing in the late 70s, last quarter of the century, those who affirm an Orthodox or even a moderately Orthodox version of Jewish identity continue to define the latter as such a fact. The problem is that they must affirm it in the face of empirical evidence to the contrary. So orthodoxy, and here he means Orthodox Judaism, a Jewish orthodoxy, asserts that it could proceed into the latter decades of the 20th and moving on to the 21st century because it clings on to something called tradition. The Orthodox precisely defines Jewish identity tied to tradition, as destiny. We are fated toward it. while the social experience of the individual, this is the individual of the America, being American, reveals it as an ongoing choice. To be religious is a constant choice, argues Berger, in the last decades of the 20th century. I'm not forced, I'm not compelled by any state-sponsored religion to identify with it, or a government to assign myself a faith group. I choose it every single day that I wake up at some ungodly hour. I get into the shower, get out, have my coffee, and drive a few minutes to shul. I am making the affirmative choice that I'm going to do Jewish today. Nobody's compelling me to do that. It's not compulsory in the slightest. The dissonance between definition and experience. I define myself as an Orthodox Jew, and therefore I have fidelity to tradition. There is a gap between that and the ongoing decision to be Orthodox today. The dissonance between definition and experience is at the core of every orthodoxy in the modern world. We don't live in an orthodoxy which forces us to do our faith. We're not living in a medieval or an early modern community which compels us as a member of a religious society to practice, to adhere to our religion today. We have that choice. The Orthodox defines himself or herself as living in a tradition. It is of the very nature of tradition to be taken for granted. We don't think about these things. It's not as if when I wake up and I have my coffee is that I'm making the conscious decision. You know what? I think I'm going to be Orthodox again today. We don't think about it. We take it for granted. This taken for grantedness, however, is continually falsified by the experience of living in a modern society. Not to say that religion is false, but my decision to wake up and remain an Orthodox Jew is not compulsory. It's not destiny, like I'm fated to it. I am consciously, and it's like, I always make that decision to remain within the fold. The Orthodox must then present to himself as faith what he knows empirically to be choice. This is a difficult feat. And so in a book that has nothing to do with Orthodox Judaism, in a book which is about American religion and modern and a technological society, as Berger would term it, he uses Orthodox Judaism as his prime example of a group that has, despite all of the contingencies of modern life, we still think that it's our fate, that we have no choice but to be Orthodox Jews. So in the world of the yeshiva world, and actually this is not the yeshiva world, this is Rav Aaron Cutler on our left, a rare picture, although I think it appeared in Jewish Action not too long ago. Here is Rav Aaron Cutler. Anybody know where he's lecturing? Where he's giving he wouldn't call a lecture, he'd be giving a shiur. Anybody know? Still looks like this today. Is the Bialystoker Synagogue. Tzvi Ram is the wonderful rabbi there. And in a lecture he delivered, not at the Bialystoker Synagogue, but several times over in his yeshiva, and he comes to America in 1941, does Rav Aaron Cutler, of course, is the architect of BMG, of Beis Medrash Gavoha, the great yeshiva in Lakewood. And what is the secret of Jewish continuity? Is relying on davka, specifically the Ziknei V'Lomdei HaTorah, the great scholars and elders of Torah Judaism, Shebedor, in our generation, because for me and the other people who carry within them Das Torah, this intuition, this extra legal, it's not a question, Das Torah, maybe we should pause here to define it. Das Torah is almost a Ruach HaKodesh, is a belief that not only do certain marquee rabbinical figures know how to answer a shaila of Isser Veheter, a shaila of what is kosher and what is treif, if Sefer Torah is puzzle or not, Shabbos lamps and timers, things of the sort, but also extra legal things, political items, educational decisions that remain fully outside of the halachic world, who we should date, who we should marry, all these decisions are tied up that are beyond the Dalin Chalkei Shulchan Aruch, that are still within the orbit of rabbinic decision making, because these are the people who have the rabbinical intuition, who can key in on God's mandate. Because these people have the ability, champions of Aaron Cutler, to decide what is the way of God. And that's incredibly important for the sake of continuity. So one of the great examples of public policy, which is meant to steer, which Berger could not have anticipated, which he was not clued into, is that what the gatekeepers of tradition, particularly in what I'm calling the yeshiva world, people call it the ultra-Orthodox world. Years ago, we called it the black hat community. However you term it, the Orthodox right, what Berger, and actually he writes, he passed away recently, but about 40 years after he had written the heretical imperative, which is not really about heresy, he had indicated that there is such a concept within Orthodox Judaism, which is the key, which is the secret of its continuity, which is how it's been able to repel modernity, is because of the great wisdom and not just the direction offered by rabbinic leadership, but the adherence of their constituencies. And there is no greater example of that in the annals of the history of the American yeshiva world than in 1956. In 1956, a psak din, and this is on the left side, which was issued by, it happened to be the president of the Rabbinical Council of America, Rabbi David Hollander, wrote a shaila to 11 prominent Roshei Yeshiva. I believe 9 out of 11 were from New York. One other was Rosh Yeshiva Baltimore, Ner Israel, Rav Ruderman. Another was Rav Gifter. The rest were were Roshei Yeshiva, not pulpit rabbis. And they issued a psak din, not a tshuva, a psak. And it's worth reading in full. See, Rabbi Hollander was deeply unsettled that his organization, the Rabbinical Council of America, participated in something which eventually petered out, called the Synagogue Council of America, in which Reform, Orthodox, and conservative rabbinical and congregational bodies worked together. Now, I should say that the Orthodox Union only agreed to join the Synagogue Council on condition that it have a veto. So it didn't have to listen to any halachic decision making. In fact, the Synagogue Council did not purposely issue halachic pronouncements. Usually it was on the civic side. But nevertheless, Rabbi Hollander was terribly disturbed by it. And so these 11 Roshei Yeshiva, led by Rav Aaron Cutler, Kasher Nisha'alnu, Mikama Rabbanim B'Medina, we've been asked many times, not just Rabbi Hollander, Umikama Chanichei Umusmachei HaYeshivot, I'm on the left side, and here it is in Hebrew and in English. We've been asked by everybody, every rabbi you can imagine, a pulpit rabbi, an educator, principals, if we can participate in, and this is their Hebrew, the New York Board of Rabbis. You know that when you transliterate rabbis, you know you don't really mean rabbis. Ukamokain, and similarly, can we be a part of the New York Board of Rabbis, which is, again, an intra-denominational board, still exists today, of Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox rabbis. Ukamokain, b'mosdot domim lezeh, b'shar erot. And other organizations, not just the New York Board of Rabbis, the Boston Board of Rabbis, whichever. Asher heim murchavim yachad im rabbis, hariformim v'conservatim. Can we partner in these organizations with the non-Orthodox? V'hinei, B'daseinu yachad levarer. We have joined together in order to clarify ha'inyan yatzeh me'itenu. Ki asar al pi din Torah Kedosha. It's asar. No explanation, but based on the charisma and the reputation of these important rabbinical figures, these Roshei Yeshiva, the heads of these burgeoning yeshivas, it's asar. Liot chaver lishatef be'irgun kazeh. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein signed this tshuva. Anybody who's opened up in Igros Moshe knows that Rav Moshe Feinstein is perfectly capable. It is beneath me to have to justify this on behalf of Moshe Feinstein. He was perfectly capable of rattling off source after source, proof text after proof text, making a cogent halachic argument. This type of argument, though, one that said it is usher and that is it, never appears in all the volumes of Igros Moshe, whether you hold that only 1 through 7 are authentic or 8 and 9 as well. It doesn't matter. Ukamokain, and similarly, continuing on in the second to last paragraph, Nishanu im mutar lishatef liyot chaver b'synagogue council be'America. Why bet gets a normal Hebrew Hebraization and isn't transliterated, I don't know. Asherhu morchav gamkein im urganei hareformim v'conservativim. Also, the Synagogue Council of America, national body. Are we able to participate in them? Ask these Orthodox rabbis. V'yatzami ki asar al pi din. Getting a little bit of echo. Asar al pi din, Torah Kadosh Lishatefi Mahem Bain Bitor Yachid. You can't join, right? These 11 Rosh Yeshiva, whether you're an individual rabbi, Bain Bitor Gush Irgun Tziburi, whether you're standing behind a formalized organization. Either way, Hashem Yisbarach Yirachim Mimo, the Yagdir Prutzoteno, and may God protect us from these terrible breaches of the Torah. V'niska La Ramat Karen Torah Kedosha B'Yisrael. God, by withstanding the pressures of joining the Synagogue Council of America, New York Board of Rabbis, the Torah community, the Orthodox community, should be safe and raise the stature of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and his holy Torah and the Jewish people. Okay. Again, my business here is not to critique whether or not this was a worthwhile position, only that this looks different than other tshuvot, which is why, if you take a look, and here you have in the Yeshiva College newspaper, the commentator had a whole multiple page spread of it, but the important passage here that I want to look in is here. The committee, this is the Rabbinical Council of America, voted 22-4 against Das Torah. 22-4 did the executive committee vote against these 11 Rosh Yeshiva to temporarily maintain the status quo and thus remain in the Synagogue Council. After a vote was taken, after Rabbi Hollander issued this tshuva. This tshuva appears first in 1956, right before Purim. The vote after this is solicited is taken by the RCA members, and they vote against Das Torah, which leads Rabbi Meir Amsel, a very prominent rabbi and editor of a journal called HaMaor. He had a more favorable vote. It's actually quite pleasant to be speaking about a vote that has nothing to do with 2020. He writes the following in an editorial in his rabbinical journal, also around that time. Based on this calculation, 40%. So it wasn't as overwhelming according to his data. Not sure what he was looking at. But either way, the RCA did remain, and they voted against Das Torah. That 40% of the Rabbinical Council, Hinam Balei Torah V'Yira, these 40%, the minority, they're God-fearing Jews, V'Datam Das Torah. And their allegiance conforms with Das Torah. U'Kenegdam, Shishim Achuz, but they're those pesky 60%. Notim lead Bolut that are siding with the assimilationists, and totally irreconcilable. How they could vote against the will of Torah, the Das of Torah. So for the yeshiva world, for a growing population, we'll see just how they grew in numbers so quickly. Das Torah became key for the situation of this community. And so, a spokesman, Rabbi Joseph Friedenson, writes in the late 1960s, a new appreciation of the meaning of Das Torah, the unique Torah view expressed by the Torah scholar, has resulted. He understands, the Aguda understands how powerful this rabbinical intuition, this charisma is. Has resulted from the example set by the American Agudas Yisrael organization, submitting all major policy decisions to the Moetzas Gedolei Torah, to the council, the executive committee of the yeshiva world of the Agudas Yisrael. And Mordechai Gifter writes, this is from a book in the 1980s, but he said this much earlier on in the late 60s, early 70s, by means of this Das Torah, this rabbinical intuition, the great men of Torah actually see what others at best know but do not see. They can tap into something much more potent, much more powerful. Great Torah leaders are granted a visual sense from the world of the Torah's mystery, a world of eternity, at a time when smaller people, that's me, understand and feel everything only according to our small world, the revealed world. And in an interview with recently late Professor William Helmreich, Rabbi Henoch Leibowitz, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Chavetz Chaim, it's not explicitly codified, so to speak, but it's the Torah concept, Das Torah. We're speaking on why the yeshiva world has been able to flourish already by the 70s. Das Torah, what we call, and those people that carry with them that outlook, that conviction, that there is Das Torah, and that we submit to the greater Talmidei Chachamim of the previous generation with their outlook, and that keeps the checks and balances in place. And in the Jewish Observer, the Agudas magazine, when it just appeared in the early 1960s, Rabbi Bernard Weinberger talked about this. All of a sudden, new language about Gedolim and Das Torah are emerging as part of the Sprach, as part of the formulations, the language, the expressions of Orthodox Judaism. And so he writes in an off-cited article, The Making of a Gadol. This is before, unfortunately, I'm always referring to these people as the late. They just passed away. Is Rav Nosson Kamenetsky in his Making of a Gadol. There may be many are recognized Torah scholars, and yet they don't attain this wide acclaim. Not every rabbi gets Das Torah. I have rabbinical ordination. I can tell you, everybody is my witness. I do not have Das Torah. There is some ingredient that transcends scholarship alone or piety alone that makes one a gadol. Obviously, these qualities of knowledge, erudition, and piety are basic. But over and above these, there is another factor that is crucial, and that is what we generally describe as Das Torah. So already there's an assumption that people know what this concept is. This involves a lot more than a Torah Weltanschauung or a Torah-saturated perspective. It assumes a special endowment or capacity to penetrate objective reality, recognize the facts as they really are, and apply the pertinent halachic principles. It is a form of Ruach HaKodesh, as it were, which borders, if only remotely, on the periphery of prophecy. Little wonder then that many, an arrogant layman or rabbi, will exclaim, "What does that gadol know about the facts or realities of the situation?" But it is precisely in the area of sizing up the situation, predicting the consequences of any given action, and applying the Torah principles specifically germane to the situation. Now, it's not just on a compelling, Das Torah and the concept of Gedolim in America doesn't emerge just because it is ideologically or philosophically compelling, but also emerges because there is a rising generation of Orthodox young people. And here, Torah Masorah, which is around today, but does something very different than it used to. And it used to plant seed money and try to mobilize and lobby various communities, particularly outside of New York, to establish day schools led by Rav Aaron Cutler. Here is a map of the number of Jewish children a graph, of children enrolled in Jewish day schools. 1917, you have a pittance, and you see that number really starts to spike in the post-war period. In the 1960s, here is some data on who's enrolled in various yeshivas, particularly in New York. Yeshiva University claims the largest enrollment of any yeshiva in 1965. These all come from the late Alvin Schiff. I'm making it a habit of referring to everybody as late, but these people all passed away in the last couple months to 2 years. A little bit over 450. Torah V'Yira is Satmar Yeshiva. Torah V'Das is the first non-Hasidic yeshiva, non-modern Orthodox yeshiva, with close to 250. The Mir in Brooklyn, not in Israel, has also close to 250. Beis Medrash Gavoa is floundering, just above 200. And here you have some of the data. Modern Orthodox Yeshiva University seems very strong. Where I'm affiliated, Hebrew Theological College is third from the bottom, has about an enrollment of 130 at the time. Again, this is the mid-1960s. This is just after Aaron Cutler has passed away in the early 1960s, 1962. Here is Lakewood's enrollment over the last 100 years. It started out in Kletsk, where Aaron Cutler moved it from Slutsk. You see that in 1939, there are no numbers because that's where Aaron Cutler moved. I'm happy to provide the slides to anybody who would like it. I'm sorry if it's not large enough for you. And then all of a sudden, it starts to skyrocket. And you see it also in that 60s. It starts to spike. And these numbers are actually quite stale. It only goes up to 2005. And these are numbers, I should say. I want to thank Rabbi Aaron Cutler, the CEO of BMG. He's always very helpful in providing me with fascinating data. But BMG now has something around 6,000 students. And that's not even the COLA. That's not even the COLA. 6,000 unmarried teenagers and young and men in their early 20s are studying in Lakewood. And it's not just the day schools. It's not just the day schools. The yeshiva world gets it. They understand how to do Judaism in the United States. So here you have an editorial in a periodical called The Orthodox Youth. How exciting is it? It's designed for young people. There is no such magazine like it for tradition-bound Jews in the United States. Campbell Gouda at last, they understand the secret of religious communities is building camp. Every kid wants to go to camp, and every parent wants to send their child to camp. And Camp Aguda and Camp Benosa merged, and Rav Moshe, Rav Hutner, Rav Aaron Cutler, they're all visiting. And when they visit, the counselors are telling the boys, tidy up your bunks, wear your finest. Rav Aaron Cutler's coming. Let me tell you a story about Rav Aaron Cutler. And all of a sudden, the charisma and the reputation is growing already in the 1940s for these larger-than-life rabbinical personalities, these Rosh Yeshiva who had already made a reputation for themselves in Europe, but the people around them have designed a form of charisma that is reaching them. They're inventing, they are constructing media and outlets for young people to fully appreciate who these people are and their decision making. That's on the left side. On the right side is, I don't know if my video is still showing with this PowerPoint, but is rabbi cards, photo cards of Gedolei Yisrael, and I actually have a complete set. Here's the very first card, is Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. A little clunky looking, right? It's black and white, all deceased rabbis. Nothing fancy, larger than a baseball card, certainly, but all of a sudden you can collect these rabbi cards. And so it's the impression and the lens in which we're looking at these rabbis are gaining a particularly American perspective. We are gaining access to them as children in boys' camps and in girls' camps. We are collecting them along with our Mickey Mantle, our Roger Maris, and I dare say our Sandy Koufaxes. And then we see that in non-Torah matters, but in scholarship and in portions of wisdom that are beyond the textual evidence we have in the Chumash, maybe, and in the Talmud, maybe, all of a sudden, rabbis are weighing in. So, for example, when psychotherapy is all the rage, particularly in the post-war period, there's an article appears about that in the Jewish Observer. Evolution, which again is a very, very sensitive issue. There's no question about it, but there are Orthodox exponents who have explained how there could be an evolution with the 6 days of creation. And there wasn't much talk about it in the Orthodox community really until the 1960s. It's also interesting to see who is writing these articles in the Aguda Monthly. So one, we have I don't know any of these people, Dr. Jacob Mermelstein. Look at how he is introduced to the readers. A psychologist in a private practice, is certified in the field of the state of New York and New Jersey, and is a diplomat of the American Board of Professional Psychology. He's a well-known lecturer and author, and is featured columnist in Torah Masorah's parent magazine. So his punchline, his money quote of a bio, is that he's from. In the evolution article, it's authored by somebody who has in his biology, a Rabbi Spetner, who there's much more said about Rabbi Spetner. It says that he is a scientist, yes, but it also indicates where he studied in yeshiva, where he davens, and his affiliation. You can trust him. Why? Because he conforms to the will of these Rosh Yeshiva, of an orthodoxy. It's not just enough that he's a scientist and here is his CV, but we are crafting his reputation out of a yeshiva milieu. And then a Dr. Sylvian Chain, likewise, in an article about the credo of a frum scientist, again, the biography of all three authors are meant to indicate why you can trust them. Yes, they come from an external wisdom, a non-rabbinic wisdom, but don't worry, these are safe writers. And perhaps the most famous rabbi doctor in the history of rabbi doctorhood is Rabbi Abraham J. Torsky. And this is a terrifically complicated and take it for granted. It's a very, very important quotation. Rabbi Torsky, of course, is a foremost psychotherapist in the frum world, and he looks the way he does on his left, which bodes well for, redounds to his cause. Although a rabbi may be authorized to issue rulings on questions that can be answered by halakha, that does not necessarily qualify him to render an opinion on matters for which there are no direct halakha guidelines. In such cases, one should be guided exclusively by Torah hashkafa. And so, as more and more wisdom is emerging in contrast to Torah wisdom, all of a sudden, what is popping up are conversations about who do you trust, the Das Torah or experts in other fields. There are principles of Torah hashkafa that can serve as guidelines for all situations in life. However, a person giving an opinion must be certain that his opinion is based on pure Torah concepts. This can be done only by someone whose entire thought processes are the result of Torah knowledge. I have studied psychology, and it's possible that my thinking may have been influenced by my secular studies, writes Rabbi Torsky. Even if I had adequate Torah knowledge, or even if I was qualified to have Das Torah, I could not be considered Das Torah because I have been subject to concepts that did not derive from Torah. I have been polluted by secular wisdom, and therefore I could not, even if I reached the stature of Das Torah, I am not qualified because I have muddied the waters, my own personal wisdom, with extra Torah knowledge. And so other wisdom is called into question. So when a scientist writes in the Jewish Observer a rather apologetic and frum sort of article, people are calling into question. An unnamed letter writer from St. Louis writes in response to a Dr. Seymour Glick saying, "Who is this guy? I have often wondered if the Jewish Observer is subject to review before publication by a gadol. This person can't speak for me. He has other wisdom." And it's not just in Orthodox Judaism, but in other religious spheres. And I'm being very careful here. I'm not trying to suggest that one was borrowed for the other, but other faith groups are being very cautious, circumspect about external wisdom that, again, are challenging the traditionalism. This is what Peter Berger had suggested was the problem with any type of orthodoxy, that you're going to be infiltrated by other forms of modernity and other forms of wisdom. So Reverend John Rice says the following: most of all, men are not equal in authority. They ought not be and cannot be. These that have the rule over the Christians are their spiritual advisors and pastors. These people are to be trusted. Nobody else. Watching over their souls, since preachers must give an account to God for their people. Not to suggest that this person has das Torah, I mean nothing of the sort, but every faith community, every orthodoxy in the 1960s, and this is from the 1940s, but the 60s, 70s, and 80s is terribly worried about how they're going to retain their flocks in an increasingly complicated modern world. Well, for the modern Orthodox, and I'm conscious of the time, has never adhered to this das Torah. In fact, Rabbi Soloveitchik, what's interesting about this image is that it was actually taken the opposite direction, but yet it every time it's displayed, including right here, it's always flipped, because for some reason this image looks better from Rabbi Soloveitchik's other side. I can't explain. I resent very much in the bolded section. I resent very much that certain Rosh Yeshivas writing in 75 and certain teachers want to impose their will upon the boys. It is against the law. Rabbi Soloveitchik offers a counter position, a more democratic position to rabbinic authority, that rabbinic will doesn't and shouldn't always hold sway. And Rabbi Norman Lamb, continuing in our theme, the recently late great president of Yeshiva University, Rabbi Norman Lamb, in the late 1970s, delivers a speech before the Rabbinical Council of America, saying that everybody's accusing us of heresy for these extra halachic proclamations. Let me say that we have to have courage in the face of the yeshiva world. But das Torah is growing, the yeshiva world is growing. By 2013, the Pew study found that of the 5 million Jews in the United States, 10% are Orthodox. So 500,000 Jews in the United States identify as Orthodox. 30% identify of that Orthodox identify as what we would call modern Orthodox. A full 70% identify as yeshivish or Hasidic was their terminologies. So this community is growing, the yeshiva world, and not the modern Orthodox community. And das Torah is taking over. Not my business to decide rightly or wrongly. And so here you have a woman writing in the Jewish Observer, a fantastic newspaper that's recently digitized and I'm taking full advantage of, saying, Beis Yaakov, we don't believe in college. It's against das Torah. Here you have excess of materialism is against das Torah. This is a footnote in the Medrash Says in the early 1980s, excoriating people who spend too much money, $20,000. Think about this in the early 80s, and then calculate for inflation. It's an attack on consumerism. And here is a letter writer commenting on a recent Aguda convention keynote by Rabbi Aaron Cutler's son, Rabbi Schneier Cutler, who also explains, based on his own personal das Torah, attacking American materialism in the 1980s. But somehow, though, it's not just about the rabbinic charisma, it's also about the American conditions. It's ironic that it's American materialism which helps, which supports das Torah and what is gracious and what is good and what is compelling about the yeshiva world. So, for example, on the left side is actually from the Siyum Shas in the late 1990s. So I'm skipping on a little bit. This is a play off of the story about Rabbi Akiva and his wife Rachel. Rachel, of course, gave up her inheritance. She was an heiress of Kalba Savua, and she gave up all of her money to marry this poor shepherd Akiva, who eventually became Rabbi Akiva. And that's when he comes back with all of his students, 24,000 of them. They say, "Who is this woman in her rags?" Kol shali v'shalachem shalah. They're very poor. Gemara and Shabbos, she gets a gold necklace out of it. But here you see that American materialism, this story which is about poverty, about embracing moderation, embracing destitution. Here is this, I guess he's a gem dealer in the diamond district somewhere, who is advertising, buy your wife because you finished the Shiyam Hashas. Apparently only men finished the Shiyam. Because you finished Shas in 1997, buy your wife a Shali B'Shalachem Shalah 14-karat gold charm. It's the American materialism, which is coming to the fore. And here you have, not just that you saw the good Gedolim cards, these were rather flimsy and didn't look like baseball cards. But by the late 1980s, a fellow in Baltimore, Arthur Sugarman, develops real rabbi cards that are color picture that give their statistics on the back. And if you can see the size, they fit in your palm. They look, this is series 5 actually, they look like true baseball cards. And I mentioned Arthur Sugarman. He even appeared on the quiz show To Tell the Truth. That's an image of him. I find Gedolim cards absolutely fascinating, and apparently so do Americans. So on the left side, you have a page out of Sports Illustrated in the late 1980s. In the middle, you have Time magazine. It's all kosher, writes a headline in Sports Illustrated. Time magazine, bubble gum not included. Hey, I'll trade you a Ruderman for a Feinstein. Apparently, though, that wasn't a fair trade. So apparently people like to rank their rabbis quite a bit, which is very, very American. And then apparently the only people who were not taken with rabbi cards and rabbinic charisma again were the modern Orthodox. So here you see in a Yeshiva University publication, Hamabaser for a Purim satire. Chops Chewing Gum presents, obviously a playoff of Tops trading cards, centrist Orthodox Gedolim cards, a reprinting of the classic modern Orthodox, because we don't call themselves modern Orthodox anymore. By the late 1980s, they're calling themselves centrist Orthodox. A reprinting of the classic modern Orthodox Gedolim set issued 10 years ago. Collect both cards. So apparently the only people who were not awash in Gedolim cards, in every day school, every Rabbi is giving them out, are the modern Orthodox. Which brings me to today, skipping a couple of decades and trying to understand why is all of this relevant? Because I think that all of this background helps really understand what's happening today. So one of our heroes, I think it's fair to claim he is a hero, is Rabbi Dr. Aaron Glott, who has done so much for advising all, I can imagine, West Orange, certainly in Skokie, Illinois. He's been tremendous in advising our safety and security during the ongoing pandemic. It should go away soon. We hear wonderful optimism about vaccine. We can only hope that the days of Zoom exclusive, I don't think Zoom's going away for good, but Zoom exclusive Torah education hopefully will be a thing of the past quite shortly. But here, take a look at even Rabbi Glott's language. In an update article right before Rosh Hashanah, in just the past 24 hours, I have been inundated with numerous pressing shilas from communities. He's not speaking in this article, he's not writing in this article about Hilchot Sefer Torah. His shilas are medical. He's answering the question not as a rabbi. He's answering as a physician. Why are we so, number one, he's a genius, and he's wonderful, and he's sensitive, and he's humble, but also because he is a Rabbi Dr. Aaron Glott. He is a level of expertise that for the modern Orthodox in our world where we cannot just accept the will and the decision-making of Das Torah, we aren't, though, however, looking for just the greatest expert. We are looking for experts with particular cultural cues. We are looking for scientists, for epidemiologists who get us. As modern Orthodox, we don't totally eschew the world of rabbinic decision making. And in fact, I would submit we never have. Whether it's a Rabbi Bleich or Rabbi Tendler and their articles that appeared in tradition, or the Rabbi Levines in the world, who trained us on how to understand Jewish business ethics. We have looked in the modern Orthodox world, and we've been blessed in the modern Orthodox world, I'll submit, to not just experts, but experts who can stand on both sides, who can be experts in extra Torah wisdom, but also stand firmly ensconced in our Orthodox community. We want people who get us as a faith community. And similarly, I'll share a note that came out of Chicago, also around that time in September 2020. We, the undersigned, from physicians of the Chicago Jewish community. It's similar to those bios that I read to you and that we reviewed together in the Jewish Observer. Even in the modern Orthodox community, we're not interested just in the best doctors who are totally detached from the Jewish community in the Orthodox arena. We want from physicians. We want people who understand our plight, our situation, our sensitivities, our conditions. In that way, while the Orthodox community, the modern Orthodox community, has always had its trifles with Das Torah, at the same time, we have always looked for experts. In our time, it shines like a bright light. We have always looked for leaders who get us, who understand our cultural idiosyncrasies, who understand the particulars of our condition. While we have not been willing to totally give ourselves over to Das Torah, to rabbinic modern day Ruach HaKodesh, we have to acknowledge, and I think in a happy way, that we have, number one, been able to produce experts within our community, that we have trained our sons and daughters into non-rabbinic fields, in the worlds of sociology, of science, of medicine, of law, of physics, of popular culture. We have trained our children to be experts in so many different vistas of wisdom, but we have also asked them that when you opine and when you support our community, that you get us as well, and that you showcase, and that from an outward-facing perspective, you demonstrate that you're not just a part of America's world, but you're a part of our Orthodox community as well. That has always been the key to survival. For the yeshiva world, it's rabbinic charisma, it's Das Torah. For the modern Orthodox community, yes, it's been an exposure and an embrace of Americanism, but one that has never left an earshot of the peculiarities of our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Doctor, can we take a couple questions? Can I read a couple?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have one question from Rich Sobin, which is a good one. Is Das Torah claimed by Gadol or achieved or deferred upon him? How generally does it arise?
It's a really good question. So Yaakov Katz, Dr. Jacob Katz, he dated the concept of Das Torah back to the 1870s, and also when papal infallibility was decided upon in 1871. But you rarely find Das Torah as a proclamation of the rabbinic personality, in this case himself, but the people who surround him. Meaning, what's interesting, and people don't, there's a book to be written about the Askin, right? The wheeler and dealer, the shamish, the people who are taking care of these rabbinic personalities. So usually it's the people, it's the inner circle that's claiming it, although there are exceptions. For instance, Rav Elia Shvei, the great Rosh Yeshiva of the Philly Yeshiva, he claimed Das Torah for himself. But you think about it in your mind about powerful leaders. It's not they themselves that claim authority, but it's the people around them that push these people up. It's part of sort of the calculus of charisma development.
If there are any other questions, why don't you submit them? can read them off.
And Greg, since you're on, let me thank you so much for persevering and making sure that we connect.
Thank you. And thanks to Marilyn Smilowitz for making this possible. Thanks to everybody for their interest. There's a comment from Ethan. I remember Rabbi David Hollander in 1970 still lobbying for the RCA to withdraw from the Synagogue Council of America.
Yeah, he didn't quit.
Actually, if I could interject, I was at the RCA convention with my parents, and he was going around still trying to get the RCA to vote itself out.
Oh, he was in Lincoln Square Synagogue in the late 1980s when Rabbi Riskin came back to America, and they debated what, and the audio is still around. He never forgot it. He had a challenging life, did Rabbi Hollander. But he felt very offended. Eventually, every 5 or 10 years, the Orthodox Union and the RCA would have various votes of whether or not they should maintain. There's a book, biography of Harold Jacobs, the longtime Orthodox lay leader. And the author is Rafi Redoff, excuse me. And he shows is that a lot of politicking, a lot of filibustering about these votes.
So I have a question.
In the end, 94, the Synagogue Council of America just conked out. It didn't exist any longer.
Okay, I have a couple questions. Let's go to them. This one I don't follow necessarily, but hopefully you do. By Rabbi Twersky's definition, would he deny that the Rambam and the Ramban and others would not have Das Torah?
It's really interesting. You have to ask. Thank goodness he's still alive. It's something I haven't considered yet. If a rabbinical personality of 800 years ago. In the question, let me just unpack the question for a bit. Rabbi Twersky denied himself Das Torah because even if he were fit, if he had a reputable level of Torah knowledge, he had contaminated himself with a PsyD, where he has a medical degree. So with the Rambam likewise, because he was polluted with Aristotelian wisdom, would he have compromised his own Das Torah? I have a feeling that the Rambam himself would have surrendered his Das Torah.
Wow.
But I don't know. It's interesting.
Wow.
What would he have said?
That's crazy. All right. Another question. Howard Weiser asks, where does the Hasidic Rabbi fit into the picture? And I guess you could ask also this about the Shtiebel itself, the European Shtiebel, and also the Hasidic Rabbi.
And so certainly the Ger Rabbi and the Belzer Rabbi and the emergence of the Aguda, and I made this, I know, a very American conversation, and really a post-war conversation. So certainly there are one terrific guy, Gerson Bacon, and I mentioned Yaakov Katz to talk about the origins, and Larry Kaplan as well, have very important essays on the origin of Das Torah, and certainly Hasidic rabbis are a part of it, and they are the ones who push it. But I'll also point out is the Hasidization, a word I just coined, I suppose, of the yeshiva world, in the sense that now yeshivas are passed on from father to son. They're a family business. So in some ways, the yeshiva world has taken that on. And in fact, the title page that I provided of the Siyama Shas from, I believe, 1975 has Hasidic Rebbes and Roshei Yeshiva sitting on the Presidium together. Now it used to be that the Misnagdim and Hasidim didn't like one another. But now I think that more and more their points of view are coalescing, although not always the same. But very often scholarship blends them together.
A good question from Dr. Strauchler. Please comment on Das Torah during the Holocaust.
So I in Das Torah before the Holocaust, people point, one of the great proponents and exponents of Das Torah is Chanan Wasserman, who strictly forbade his disciples from moving to America. He himself was in America in 1938, and despite attempts to keep him here, he refused to remain in America. And by virtue of Das Torah, he kept many Jews in Europe in harm's way, and that Ima Badim Smecha has a line which rather was upset about that position. Certainly, who knows what would have happened, but certainly there's a lot of decision making before the Holocaust and migration that has much to do. And Chavetz Chaim wrote 2 volumes, Chanidcha Yisrael, trying to keep this is in the 1890s, way before the Holocaust, of trying to keep people from moving to America. I think that the other point I'll say about it is Lawrence Kaplan, Larry Kaplan, has an article on Rav Hutner's Das Torah, in which Rav Hutner developed that in a post-Holocaust world, Das Torah was the only wisdom that we had at our disposal of how to make decisions.
So he argued it should be stronger post-Holocaust than before. It was more
Yeah,
important.
and Rav Hutner was a very strong personality. It used to be lore, but now people tell me that they know the person who invented it. But he had a button on the bottom of his office desk, which locked the door that you couldn't leave Rav Hutner's office. He was a very, very strong personality, a domineering one.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, and we've been listening to fascinating stuff for a while. So I want to thank everyone for their attention, their participation, and we've wanted to have you in our community. Sadly, COVID has prevented that, but we're thrilled that you were able to join us remotely, virtually. And we hope to welcome you into West Orange in the right time when we can all be healthy and safe. And we wish you well, and we thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, and Maryland for sponsoring a wonderful community with a very highly regarded reputation. Glad to at least zoom in on Eastern time for at least an evening.
Thank you. Zagazun, everybody. Be well.
Rabbi Eleff, we
Thank
look forward to hosting you when this is all over.
Amen.
Amen.